4,000 years ago, if your baby wouldn't stop crying, the doctor's advice was opium. That was the prescription from an actual physician. And somehow, that's not even the weirdest solution on the list. This is the story of what ancient humans actually did when babies wouldn't stop crying. And one of the answers will make you feel like a genius, and one of them will make you want to call Child Protective Services. Let's start with the biology, because the problem runs deeper than you think. Human babies are uniquely terrible at being babies. Every other primate, chimps, gorillas, orangutans, is born able to cling to their mother, born able to regulate their own temperature, born with a brain that's mostly done. Human babies arrive with only 25% of adult brain volume. Can't cling, can't walk, can't do basically anything. We evict the fetus early because otherwise that big brain wouldn't fit through the birth canal. The skull has to exit before it finishes growing. The result, a creature whose entire survival strategy is screaming until an adult fixes the problem. And in the Pleistocene, that screaming isn't just annoying, it's a beacon. Predators, rival groups, anyone within earshot who wants to know exactly where your band is camped tonight. The stakes for shutting the baby up were literally life and death for the whole tribe. So what did they do? Here's the surprising part. Hunter-gatherer babies barely cry. The Kungsan in southern Africa, the Hadza in Tanzania, their infants cry for seconds per hour. Modern Western babies at peak colic can hit 2 to 3 hours of crying per day. Same species, but radically different outcome. The difference isn't genetics, it's what the adults are doing. Hunter-gatherer infants are carried 90% of waking hours, breastfed roughly every 13 minutes. When one adult gets tired, a father, a grandmother, an older sibling steps in. The baby is never, ever put down. The crying problem barely exists. But what about when even that didn't work? When a baby was sick, or in pain, or just not stopping? That's where it gets weird. The Ebers Papyrus is one of the oldest medical documents we have. Found in Egypt, 1550 BCE, it contains a prescription for continuously crying babies. Opium, mixed with fly dirt scraped from walls. According to one translation, this was from an actual medical document. Skip forward 700 years to the Roman Empire. Cyrannus of Ephesus was the greatest pediatrician in the ancient world. His textbook on gynecology and infant care was still being used in the Middle Ages. His prescription for a crying baby, honey mixed with poppy juice. He also had detailed opinions about selecting wet nurses. Their milk had to pass a smell test on a piece of glass to check viscosity. Cutting-edge medicine and opium for infants, same paragraph. And then, and this is important, nothing much changed. Victorian England had Godfrey's cordial, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, morphine in a bottle, smiling baby on the label, nicknamed the poor child's nurse. These products were responsible for thousands of infant deaths. Bottles have been found in the quarters of enslaved people, because when mothers are forced to work in fields, separated from their children by force, the drug fills the gap that the mother cannot. The opium for babies era runs from 1550 BCE to 1910. 3,500 years, same prescription, different label. But drugs were only one option. Some parents went a different direction entirely. There is a clay tablet in a museum in Philadelphia. It was found in Nippur, ancient Mesopotamia, and it dates to somewhere between 500 and 300 BCE. It is a prescription for a crying baby. Not from a doctor, but from a priest. Ancient parents who had exhausted every normal option filed noise complaints with the underworld. The tablet invokes household gods. It wishes the baby sleep like a sleepy gazelle and like drinkers of wine. It names a hairy bison-shaped house ghost called the Kasaraku. And then, the final instruction. Rub grave dust on the baby. This is not mythology. This is a real document. Ancient parents, exhausted at 3 a.m, rubbing grave dust on an infant and addressing the bison god. The Greek magical papyri, a collection of spells and recipes from Roman-era Egypt, contains PGM 7201-205, a recipe for infant crying. You make a tin amulet. You hang it around the baby's neck, and you recite the incantation. Let the child be silent, silent, like the silence of the mice. Remember that amulet. We're coming back to it. The mouse simile deserves its own moment. The benchmark for ultimate quiet, in the mind of an Egyptian magician, was mice. Not a still lake, not deep space. Mice. I cannot explain why Egyptian magicians considered mice the gold standard of silence, but I deeply respect the specificity. Some parents skipped the supernatural and went straight to physical restraint. Swaddling, wrapping the baby so tight it can't move, is attested from at least 4000 BCE. Basically every culture from Central Asia to medieval Europe used it. It works. Tight wrapping simulates the pressure of the womb and triggers a calming reflex, But medieval skeletal analysis of infant remains shows something else. Infants swaddled tightly over long periods developed measurable deformation of the bones, osteolytic changes from the wrapping. They stopped the crying and accidentally reshaped the baby. A small price to pay, apparently. Soranus. Yes, the same Soranus with the poppy juice also recommended dunking babies in cold water at birth to test their vitality. His logic: if it cries from the cold, it's healthy. If it doesn't, you have a different problem. Then there was the philosopher school of thought. Aristotle and Plato both recommended the same intervention for a crying baby. Take it somewhere louder. Markets, banquets, public processions. Two of the greatest minds in Western history looked at a screaming infant and said, more chaos, faster. And look, they weren't entirely wrong. The change of stimulation can break a crying loop. But it's funny that the answer from the men who invented formal logic was essentially, crank up the background noise. Sun Simiao was a 7th century Chinese physician, widely considered one of the greatest doctors in Chinese history. His prescription for night crying in infants: bind the baby's elbows so it can't scratch its face, then burn herbs to drive away the demons causing the crying. Half practical, half supernatural. Honestly, not that different from the range of solutions being offered in medieval Europe at the same time. But here's the thing. While philosophers were recommending chaos and priests were prescribing grave dust, some cultures never stopped doing the thing that actually worked. Quechua mothers in the Andes carry their babies in a woven Huayo shawl, pressed against the body in a fetal position, while they work in the fields. Crying is virtually non-existent until weaning. Bavenda grandmothers in southern Africa respond to a persistently crying infant by reciting ancestral names, interpreting the crying as the child reaching toward a deceased relative. It's not superstition in the dismissive sense. It's a diagnostic framework. What ancestor? What does this baby need? Let's work through it together. Every adult in the community participates in figuring it out. These weren't desperate hacks. These were the solutions that actually worked. Everything else in this video is what happened when people stopped doing this. Here is what the science says now. A 2016 paper in Current Biology by Esposito and colleagues found something that should not have been a discovery but was. Picking up a crying baby and walking, not sitting, not rocking in a chair, walking, triggers an automatic parasympathetic response in the infant. Heart rate drops. Crying stops. Within seconds. The same reflex exists in mouse pups when picked up by the scruff of the neck. It is conserved across 50 million years of mammalian evolution. The off switch was always there. We didn't discover it in 2016. We forgot it. We stopped walking 10 hours a day. We stopped living in bands of 30 people who took turns holding the baby. We started putting babies down so adults could work. And every time the village collapsed, when agriculture tied people to one place, when industrialization pulled mothers into factories, when the nuclear family replaced the extended clan and left one exhausted adult alone with an infant at 2 a.m, parents reached for the next desperate measure: magic, drugs, legal loopholes, and eventually, sleep training books, with contradictory advice sold by people who are also, clearly, exhausted. Now, remember that tin amulet. Archaeologists have found dozens of them buried with Roman-era infants. The same amulets, the same inscription, like the silence of the mice. They didn't work, and the parents buried their dead children still clutching them. That's not a punchline. That's just grief. Ancient parents loved their babies exactly as much as we love ours. They just had fewer options, less knowledge, and no way to know if the crying meant hungry or dying. They did whatever it took. So what did ancient humans do when babies wouldn't stop crying? For most of human history, they picked them up, walked with them, nursed them, passed them to the next willing adult, and never put them down. That was the answer. The whole answer. When that failed, when the baby was sick, when the village was gone, when the parent was out of options and out of sleep and out of time, they reached for opium and incantations and grave dust and the nicest smelling wet nurse they could find. The history of the crying baby is the history of human love meeting human desperation. Sometimes, for 3,500 years at a stretch, those two things look exactly the same.